Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Between Two Worlds. I am your host, Annika, and today I thought I would not necessarily go back to basics, but talk about servitors, thought forms, even a bit about tulpas and egregores for context sake. But this is a pretty rich topic that floats around quite a bit in the occult community, and even far before then of created thought forms that gain some level of autonomy. Well, yes, I know this is not a topic, so rare. I guess that's why I said back to basics, not it's not a rare topic to come across when you are not only first going into the witchcraft spaces and communities, but it is definitely reoccurring, whether that be most commonly seen in chaos magic perspectives and um, I guess, strategies of magic, but also there's a lot of rich history, and we'll talk about that today, but also some really rich use of servitors in these thought forms within folk magic practice. But before we get into that and get started, I just want to thank everyone who has gone over to my Patreon to check it out. If this content interests you, I have lots of other tasty things um, to get into over there, you know. So yeah, go and check it out and see what all the fun is about over there. If you so please, that would be well appreciated. So, servitors. Let's talk everything servitors. These created spirits, essentially, entities that are deliberately brought into being by human will, human attention, and human intention. So, with that, once created, can act with a degree of autonomy that ranges from the mechanical to the genuinely autonomous. Like I said, this is a topic that does get covered a lot in contemporary witchcraft and occult spaces. You can find 100 YouTube videos on how to make a servitor. You can find Reddit threads debating whether tulpas are real. You can find lots of chaos magic manuals that give you step-by-step instructions, like you're assembling furniture from a kit. There is no shortage when it comes to how to when it comes to servitors. But I want to talk more about not only the evidence and the uses of servitors, but a little bit deeper of, a conversation on what it means to create something so aware that, even the dissolving of it once its serving has been done. So, a servitor, in the most basic sense, is a psychic construct, an entity created deliberately by a practitioner to perform a specific task, to serve. It has a name, it has a purpose, it has a form, usually visualized and represented by anything from a sigil to a statue to just a simple rock. But the idea is you kind of create what this entity looks like from tail to nose. And it has a lifespan, a defined period of operation after which it's supposed to be dissolved. This is a really big category on its own, from drawing, sculpting, spending time to actually build every part of this spirit within your own mind, and even bringing it into the physical through those drawings or sculptures and finding its sort of anchor point, like the statue or this specific spirit house, this object used to keep it tethered. You give it its shape, its job, and its purpose. So, Phil Hine, who is one of the key figures in chaos magic and one of the people most responsible, really, for popularizing servitor work in the at least modern occult world, he describes servitors as portions of the psyche, deliberately budded off and identified by means of a name, a trait, or a symbol. And that's useful. That's a very useful starting definition. You're taking a piece of your own mental and psychic energy and you're giving it this shape and a job and you're sending it out to work. While I love me some chaos magic, that definitely finds its way into my practice, but I think, that definition, portions of the psyche budded off, this falls under the psychological model for me. It's one way of understanding what's happening, yes, and it's a very useful way, but it is definitely not the only way. And if you follow a spirit model based practice, it leans more toward what you are creating isn't just a piece of your own mind given a costume and a task, it's an actual entity. something with its own existence, however limited, something that occupies space in whatever dimension or plane you believe, non-physical entities occupy. So something that can interact with other entities, that can be perceived by other practitioners even, and that can produce effects that go beyond what your own unconscious mind could plausibly account for. So there's definitely a tension between these two models sometimes, the psychological and the spirit model. It runs through the entire history of this practice. And I don't think it's entirely resolvable. I don't think you have to resolve it. I think the most honest position is to hold, both possibilities open and really let your experience guide you. But I do think, it's important to name the tension at least, because the model you're working with affects how you approach the work. If you think you're just programming a piece of your own unconscious, you will approach it one way. And if you think you're creating an actual being, you'll approach it with a very different level of care. Now, while I start to go a little bit down the rabbit hole of history and things of that nature, I'm going to mention a lot of names here. But to start off, Jake Stratton Kent, who is one of the most rigorous voices in modern grimoire magic, has argued forcefully, really, for the spirit model. That the entities that we work with in magic are not reducible to psychological projections. That they have their own ontological status, their own reality. Now, Patrick Dunn, working from a more postmodern framework, has tried to find a middle path, arguing that the categories of real and not real are themselves too crude to capture what's actually happening in magical practice. Now, I bring this up not to settle the debate, but more or less to make sure that you are aware that it exists. Because when we start talking about creating entities, about making something that might have awareness, might have preferences, might resist being dissolved, the question of what exactly you've made becomes very practical and essentially very urgent. So, when it comes to digging into history, I don't do it because I love to bore all you listeners with it, but because number one, I love to find where and how magical concepts and practices have changed and existed, but because I honestly haven't really heard too much of anyone else tagging this part of the servitor conversation. I think we all seem to think it is a very modern occult thing. It's not it's not, just a product of chaos magic in the 1980s and 90s. The practice of creating entities to serve human purposes is among, the oldest magical technologies we have evidence for. While it look very different today, the roots of it are very similar to what we can find throughout history. So let's start in Egypt. The Ushabti, sometimes spelled Shabti or Shawabti, I believe, are small figurines, usually mummy form, that were placed in tombs to serve the deceased in the afterlife. How great is it? You have your own little army of servants once you die. But the word itself comes from the root meaning to answer, basically. So these figures were designed to answer when the dead person was called upon to perform labor in the fields of reeds, the Egyptian afterlife, which was understood as a perfected version of earthly existence, complete with agricultural work that needed doing. So within the Book of the Dead, one of, the most widely copied spells in all of Egyptian funerary literature was inscribed directly on the Ushabti figures. So the spell is essentially a contract, at least in my humble opinion. It says when the deceased is called to cultivate the fields, to irrigate the riverbanks, to ferry sand far from east to west, you, Ushabti, will answer. And you will say, here I am, you will do the work. This created entity, given form in clay or wood or stone, this effigy, if you will, given name through inscription and given a specific task through a magical formula, then activated with written word, the procedures of this are identical to what we see in modern servitor creation. And eventually by the New Kingdom, wealthy Egyptians were being buried with hundreds of Ushabti, one for every day of the year, plus overseers to manage them. I believe Tutankhamun's tomb contained around over 400 Ushabti figures, 400 created servants, each inscribed with the spell that would bring them to life in the afterlife and set them to work. Now, within the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, there are golems. There is, of course, a lot to unpack, and I'm not going to go over all the details and stories, but the golem essentially, the created being looks human but cannot speak. It can be addressed but cannot respond, and when its nature is recognized, it's returned to its raw material. The golem is a being without speech, and that detail matters enormously because in Jewish mystical tradition, speech is the divine capacity, and not just in Jewish mystical tradition. If we talk about the meanings of words and breath and incantations themselves within witchcraft, our our words and our specific voices carry the life force of our breath. So we have the power to bring things to life and we have the power to destroy things. We to make and unmake. So essentially, God speaks and creates, right? The golem's inability to speak marks the boundary between this divine creation and human imitation. You can make the form, you can animate it, but you cannot give it the spark of language of the creative world, that belongs to God or the creator alone. Now, of course, we'll talk about when servitors kind of go off script later, but this could be something that you might integrate um, within your own servitor work, maybe not giving them a certain power, which essentially withholds them from straying. So the most famous golem story, of course, is the Golem of Prague. The Maharal is said to have created a golem from clay to protect the Jewish community from anti-Semitic attacks. The golem was animated by inscribing the word emet, truth, on the forehead, and it was deactivated by erasing the first letter, turning emet into met, death. So truth gives life, death takes away, and the difference between the two is just a single letter. Now, within ancient Greece, we find the colossi, ritual effigies used in binding magic, usually made of lead, wax, clay, or bronze, that was identified with a specific person through inscription and incantation, and then bound, pierced, or, even buried to produce an effect on that person. So these were used for binding rivals in court cases, in athletic competitions, in love magic, and in warfare. They, all the essential things back in antiquity, but they were often deposited in graves among the dead so that the chthonic powers, the powers of the underworld, would enforce the binding. Now, what makes these relevant to our conversation about servitors is, the Colossus isn't just a symbol. It is not just a representation of the target in the magical logic of the practice, it becomes target, or rather, it becomes a vessel through which force can be directed at the target. It's given a name, a task, activated through ritual, and then deployed. It's essentially a material servitor, a thought form made physical. Now, the Defixionis, the curse tablets that often accompany the policy, are among the most abundant evidence, I guess, that we have for this specific magical practice. Hundreds of lead tablets inscribed with binding formulas, with the names of targets and invocations of underworld deities. One tablet, I think, from Athens, dating around like 300 and something BCE, actually lists over 100 names of Athenian citizens to be bound. The formula reads, I bind down very deeply and make disappear from humanity. Now, to me, this comes off much more like a program rather than a prayer. It's, a set of instructions given to a created magical instrument and deployed with a specific intent. Now, this kind of gets us started for the conversation and topic of servitors and spirit vessels, particularly. Now, of course, in Solomonic magic, the brass vessel, yes, the big brass vessel, is the container into which, the spirits are bound and from which they serve the magician. King Solomon's ring and seals are used to bind, compel, and confine spirits to make them serve. And within the first book of the Lemegeton, the 72 spirits or demons are accompanied by their sigils and methods for summoning and containing them. Now, by no means am I saying that these demons and spirits are servitors at all, but What I am saying is maybe the methods that we see evolve today in servitor creation have more bite to them than most people think. It's easy to see a how-to video or just read something in a book that has a list of spells or how to do something and just roll with it without understanding where it came from. When you get to understand the why of most things, especially in spirit work, it only creates advantages for you. The knowledge of how it works and where it may be split apart from in history allows you to wield it in some way. So the operational logic, you create a container, you bind an entity to it, and you give it tasks. You maintain the relationship through specific protocols. So when it comes to the actual, I guess, deeper brain picking of these created thought forms, I have to mention Annie Besant and C.W. Ledbetter in of 1901. They published Thought Forms, a book that would profoundly influence how, the Western occult world understands the relationship between mental activity and subtle reality. Because I guess nowadays it's not just all magic. There's this big influence and really hand in hand of all of these sort of psychological models within witchcraft and molding them together and uh, making them both work in tandem to reach one goal. Now, while this book was written in 1901, so just keep that in mind for, for the time, their central claim was direct and pretty startling. Ledbetter wrote, each definite thought produces two effects, a radiating vibration conveying the character of the thought and a floating form. So the idea is that, every thought, not just focused magical intention, but actually every thought produces a form on the astral and mental planes. These forms have shape, color, and duration. Strong, focused thoughts produce clear, persistent forms, while weak, scattered thoughts produce vague and quickly dissipating ones. And thoughts charged with strong emotion produce forms that are particularly vivid and long lasting. They classified thought forms into three categories: forms that take the shape of the thinker, forms that take the shape of the object being thought about, and forms that take shapes of their own. So these autonomous forms that don't resemble either the thinker or the object of thought. Now, this last category is one that matters most for our purposes because what Besant and Ledbetter were describing, this autonomous form produced by focused thought that persists independently of the thinker. If you want to understand, where the modern servitor practice actually comes from, not the ancient precedents or what it sort of came from, but the specific lineage that leads into chaos magic and this contemporary occult practice, we also have to mention Austin Osman Spare. So he is a bit of, I guess, the grandfather of modern servitor work, I would say. Definitely please do yourself a favor and look into him. But the piece that matters is, the conversation of Spare's development of the alphabet of desire. So, a system of sentient symbols, each one a condensation of a specific desire or psychic state into a visual form. Now, these aren't just sigils in the modern sense of encoded intentions. They're like living symbols, forms that once created and charged take on their own existence and their own capacity to act. So, Bear's approach was arguably very different from the ceremonial magic of his contemporaries of the time, where Aleister Crowley and the Golden Dawn built these elaborate ritual structures to contact pre-existing entities. Spare was more or less creating new ones. He was budding off pieces of his own psyche, giving them form through art and symbol, and sending them out to work. He was, in essence, the first modern servitor practitioner, though he definitely wouldn't have used that word. But now, we recognize we do the same thing, right? The connection between Spare and the modern chaos magic is direct. Peter Carroll and the Illuminates of Thanateros drew heavily on Spare's work. So Phil Hines' servitor guides are essentially these systemizations of principles that Spare actually was working with decades earlier. When you create a servitor using a chaos magic protocol, you define the purpose, you derive the sigil, you charge it in gnosis, and you set the parameters. You're following a procedure that descends directly from Spare's alphabet of desire. But there's something in Spare's work that gets lost within this system. Spare understood that the symbols he was creating were not just tools. They were alive in some sense that he took seriously. They had their own desires, their own tendencies, their own capacity to surprise him. You know, every created entity has a life cycle. It has this ability maybe to actually surprise the practitioner. You know, it involves it being born, brought into the realm of the astral or through physical. It serves its purpose, and then in one way or another, it ends. With servitors, this birth part is, what gets the most attention, the actual creation protocols, the step-by-step instructions, define the purpose, derive the sigil, choose the name, visualize the form, charge it, and then set your parameters and launch it. You have your contract, and that's it. You set it out to go work. Now the purpose is the part that gets the second most attention. What is the servitor actually for? Is it for protection? Is it for finding lost objects, attracting opportunities, reinforcing a habit, which we'll talk about later? But the purpose needs to be specific and bounded. And some argue positive, but I would argue not always positive. Servitors and their purpose do not have to be always positive. That's my take, but they could take the role of hunter, a distractor, a decoy, even a trickster. Whatever its purpose, I believe it just must be specific. The servitor created to protect your home is specific. Servitor created to make everything better is not. Vague purposes produce vague entities, and vague entities are the ones most likely to drift, to generalize, and to start maybe doing things you didn't intend, or just be sort of weak and not really work. I would say protection is one of the most common use of servitors, at least what I see when it comes to actually creating someone's like first servitor. A protection servitor guards a space, a person, or even a working. It watches for intrusion. It can hold boundaries. It, alerts you when something crosses a threshold, even if it's not entirely this protective, defensive sort of servitor, but it might just simply warn you that something has come in or something is coming in. Now, protection servitors work well because the task is usually very clear. The parameters are very obvious, and the success criteria are very simple. Anything from, again, nothing gets through. You don't need a sophisticated entity for this. You just essentially need it like a watchdog. Simple form, simple purpose, simple feeding schedule. As long as you define what it can and cannot let in, they can be very straightforward. Common use for protection servitors tend to follow this parameter model, so they don't really follow you around like a bodyguard, but they can hold the line and the edges of your property, the threshold of your door, the boundary of your ritual space, even your certain altars. They're more stationary. They're vigilant and they're aggressive only when something crosses the line. Of course, if you choose it to be. This specificity is what makes them so effective. They're not trying to protect you from everything, they're holding one boundary. Now, you can create servitors for even information gathering, tasking them with bringing you information, noticing patterns, flagging opportunities, drawing your attention to things that maybe you would otherwise miss can be really remarkably effective. Anything from actually giving them the job to scout and seek opportunities in which you have told them specifically you are looking for, or maybe even processing vastly more information than your conscious mind can handle. Sort of like a little organizer or filer within your own subconscious. And a servitor gives that processing a direction and a delivery mechanism. So it could bring you this attention, right? In the sense of you do start noticing things that maybe you wouldn't before, conversations that seem relevant, books that sort of metaphorically fall off of shelves, job postings that even appear in the right moment. Whether this is the servitor acting in the world or the servitor directing your unconscious attention is practically speaking kind of irrelevant because the results are met with either model you choose, right? There is one goal, and the fun part is you get to choose the road for how it gets there, whether it's making page 29 of Google appear first. You know, so another common use for servitors could be even a self-improvement angle. So for this part, I really think of like habit reinforcement. Creating a servitor to reinforce a habit, to remind you, to nudge you, to make a desired behavior feel more natural and the undesired behavior feel more uncomfortable is one of the most practical applications of work because whether it is to help you remember your keys when you walk out of the door, to even put your TV remote back in its correct place, or remember to stay on schedule with maybe a new gym routine. The servitor doesn't do the habit for you, right? It creates this internal pressure toward the habit. So, more creatively, you can even deploy servitors to serve as amplifications of existing workings. Now, what do I mean by that? A servitor can serve as a booster for other magical work, almost veering into like familiar territory, but it's different. If you're doing a sustained working, a multi-day ritual, a long-term petition, even a seasonal practice, you can create a servitor to sort of hold the energy between sessions, to maintain the field. It keeps the channel open. It does the equivalent of keeping the fire banked overnight, so you don't have to start from scratch each morning. Now, this is particularly useful for workings that require sustained pressure over time. So rather than doing the same ritual every day and sort of like hoping that the cumulative effects build, you create a servitor that holds the accumulated energy and continues applying pressure between your active sessions. Now, when it comes to, things that servitors maybe are not so good at by default, I would say, love is one thing. Creating a servitor, this entity to influence someone's own free will, it gets more complicated. And honestly, if you're doing something like that, there are just way better options than servitor. Also, divination, while you might have a different experience, I have tended to notice that servitors are pretty horrible at, I guess, predicting outcomes or the future or even peeking into the veil of what could be. They are excellent at gathering information to help aid you within your divination, but when it comes to actually interpreting it, the nuance that divination requires does not come natural to servitors. They're just the action piece. Really, how you choose your servitor to show you results is also a really fun one. There are so many possibilities, and of course, you need to think about how this will actually fit into your, everyday life, especially if the servitor is one that is so regular and, does fall on the more practical side. It can show you results through dreams, through smells, signs. You need to be specific here again and state this within the contract of creation with your entity so it knows very, very clearly. But once it has this down, it's really quite exciting to start seeing the results of your created entity doing the work. Personally, I love being in the dream space. So, like asking my servitors to reveal results within my dreams in specific ways is a really big one for me. This gives me an opportunity to journal, more into the dream incubation realm of things, I guess, and dissect and assess what I actually gathered from the servitor and determine, my next steps if there needs to be any, or even keeping record of what and how it presented it to me. You can choose for the servitor to give you a sudden feeling, this inner knowing of the job is being complete, a sign like a black cat crossing a four-way intersection. Just an example, but something so out of the ordinary but still attainable that it catches your attention to know that is your sign the job is complete or it's just fulfilled what you had asked it to do. This creates something for you as a practitioner to keep tabs on its effectiveness, its schedule, even to reward it as you see fit. Now, when it comes to rewarding and feeding and sustaining this entity, I want to run through, the more common procedures for this. The feeding of the servitor is what keeps it active, loyal, and of course alive. It's sustained. Most of the time, an offering uh, feeding is best suited. So, providing a physical offering, a candle, incense, a glass of water, small portion of food. This is the oldest method, of course, used across every tradition that works with created or invoked entities or spirits in general. The offering creates a physical anchor for the feeding, a tangible act that reinforces the relationship. It also creates a ritual container. So, a specific time and place where the feeding happens, which helps maintain consistency. I find it strengthens the act of bringing the physical into the non physical. So, you get your statue or whatever it's going to be housed in. You create an altar space for it, a permanent space, even it doesn't have to be a whole altar, for which you come to meet and discuss and commune, and it begins to recognize and know it has a specific home to come back to be fed, to receive sustenance and offerings, to not be in action, but to settle, to regenerate, and to just chill and eat, just chill and eat. There is, of course, emotional feeding. So this looks like maybe directing a specific emotion toward the servitor. It could be gratitude, determination. The emotion in this case, I believe, should match the servitor's purpose, like affects like. I tend to see the emotional quality of the feeding changes the entity's character over time. Once deployed, no matter the specific jobs or attitude or personality you give your servitor, the longer it's on its own, the more autonomous it starts to become drastically always, but you begin to recognize this really is something of its own action that you created, and that comes with its own list of things to just, I guess, keep in the back of your head. So that's why I think it's very useful to actually write down and determine exactly what it is you're going to offer the servitor, because if you just leave it open, mm, I guess not for interpretation, but if you just say, I will give you an offering once every new moon, you'll start to notice changes within your servitor depending on what it is you're feeding it. So, and then there's task feeding too. So, even if the servitor's purpose is, not like find my keys or remind me to call that person, I think you could actually use this kind of task giving as a way to charge the entity. You give the servitor small tasks between these major deployments. These minor tasks keep the servitor active and engaged without requiring a full charging session. So, the act of fulfilling tasks itself is satisfactory to the entity. Like when a working dog just really loves its job and it chooses to do it, it's like a reward. But finally, you will come across the topic of ambient feeding. I think this one is really popular because it's really less responsibility, I guess, on the practitioner itself. Some servitors can be designed to feed on this ambient energy, the emotional atmosphere of a room, the energy of a ley line, or, the residual charge of a ritual space. Of course, this reduces the maintenance burden on you, but it does require more sophisticated programming at the creation stage, because you're essentially giving the servitor a mouth and telling it where to eat from. You're giving it its own free will to charge and eat what it will at its own will, which could be programmed to sustain, off of its own purpose and maybe a less regular physical offering to keep it from going rogue. And, the right feeding schedule really depends on, I believe, your servitor's purpose and, of course, what fits within your own ritual life. But there are like short-term servitors, so these can range from days to weeks. It's really just like a charge once at creation, feed once midway through. The lifespan, if the task is complex, dissolve at completion. These are disposable tools. Don't overinvest. Now, there are medium servitors, so like medium term. And these are mostly fed weekly, a brief session, 5 to 10 minutes of focused attention, maybe even a small offering, and if you really want to, a reinstatement of purpose. And this maintains coherence without overfeeding it. Now, then there are, of course, long-term servitors. So this could be from anything months to years or indefinitely until you choose to dissolve the entity. So this requires more feeding on a regular schedule tied to a natural cycle, like weekly, maybe on the new moon, the solstices. The regularity matters more than the frequency. A servitor that's fed erratically becomes sort of erratic, and a servitor that's fed on a rhythm becomes very rhythmic and knows what to expect. And of course, in the long term, this is probably easier on the practitioner to keep track of. You know, if you underfeed the servitor, the effects start to diminish. Protection feels thinner, maybe information stops flowing, habits start slipping, and the servitor feels distant or absent when you check in. The sigil might even feel inert, or like not necessarily the sigil, but like the statue maybe, or wherever it is being housed in. But I do think it's important to strengthen or rekindle this relationship. Kind of like with any spirit, you put in the extra effort to correct your relationship, your loyalty even to the spirit itself, loyal to keeping it sustained so it can work better for you. So with underfeeding comes overfeeding, of course. I think less commonly seen, but still something to be aware of. And maybe even in your excitement of the servitor, you might be overfeeding it. But the servitor becomes more present than you intended. It shows up in dreams uninvited. It produces results you didn't ask for. It feels maybe even heavy or dense or demanding, and it resists your attempts to direct it. It starts to feel less like a tool and more like a roommate that won't really leave. So if you start to notice these signs, you can of course pull back. You could reduce your feeding frequency, reassert parameters. If the overfeeding has gone on long enough, the servitor maybe has developed beyond its original scope. You may need to dissolve and recreate rather than trying to trim it back. Personally, with servitors and created entities, the maintaining of a relationship proves to be one of the strongest currents within this work. Not just, the offerings themselves, you can, of course, create your weekly check-ins, sitting and meditating with your servitor, and it doesn't need to be elaborate, especially if you choose to do this on a more regular basis. Going through transvection and into your own inner mind palace, even to meet your servitor weekly, is not an easy task. But of course, it's worth it, even on maybe a once a month assessment. But when it comes to long-term servitors, I think even doing a renewal, if you will, or like maybe each quarter, like solstices or on the equinoxes, you enter, of course, your deep altered state. You reconnect with the servitor fully. You pour fresh energy into it. You restate everything, its purpose, its parameters, its boundaries, termination conditions, even. You essentially recreate it from the ground up while maintaining continuity. You can even renew its contract with new terms or updated terms, or a simple restatement of the terms itself. Now, with that, there's of course the kill switch, a specific phrase, a specific gesture, a specific act that will trigger the servitor's dissolution. You should set a lifespan if able, a defined period after which the servitor automatically deactivates, especially if it's um, not going to be one that serves you indefinitely until you specifically dissolve it. Destroying the physical token or sigil that anchors the servitor and formally ending the relationship. These are things that should be stated within the contract, of course. So when it comes to dissolution methods, visualizing the servitor dissolving back into undifferentiated energy and reabsorbing that energy into yourself, destroying the physical sigil or token, of course, by burning it, burying it, dissolving it in water, stepping on it, running it over with a car, whatever. Formally stating that the servitor's task is complete and its existence is ended. Now, this can even be an inspiration of a certain set of words that you say, or if you say something backwards, if you say something three times, or, it can range really from anything. That the big part is it's not easy to do. You don't want to accidentally, destroy your servitor just because it was, oh, I stepped on a crack on the sidewalk and now you're gone. The reason why dissolution matters is not just practical hygiene. It's more ethical. If you accept even the possibility that what you've created has some form of awareness, however limited, however different from human awareness, then you have a responsibility to end its existence cleanly rather than abandoning it. And an abandoned servitor, one that's no longer being maintained but hasn't been formally dissolved, it's like a program running in the background for your psyche, consuming resources, potentially interfering with other workings, and slowly degrading into something that you didn't intend. And I do kind of have a experience with this, but I'll tell that story in a little bit. There's something deeper here that I think is worth sitting with. And what does it mean to create something specifically in order to end it? Every servitor is born with a death sentence. It's something that you created. It's not a spirit that you met in the spirit realm. You create it knowing that it eventually will be dissolved, that you will eventually destroy it. That's a strange relationship to have with something that you've made. And I think the discomfort of that, the ethical weight of it, is something that practitioners should feel rather than avoid. And I'm sure most practitioners do when they go into servitor work, but when servitors begin to develop a sort of agency that goes off script, there are signs which, we will talk about, but what do you choose to do first of all? The first response is to reassert your original parameters. Remind the servitor through visualization, through verbal statement, through ritual of its purpose, its boundaries, its termination conditions, of course. And this is often sufficient. The servitor maybe was drifting, and a clear restatement of its programming brings it back into alignment. Now, of course, there is a renegotiation if reassertion doesn't work. Now, this might sound a little strange, negotiating with something that you created, but it's a practical reality, really, that many experienced practitioners have come across. The servitor has developed beyond its original parameters rather than trying to force it back into a box it's outgrown. You can redefine the relationship, give it new parameters, expand or modify its purpose, and sort of meet in the middle, acknowledge what it has become. Now, the third response is, of course, to just end the relationship and dissolve or destroy the spirit. If the servitor has become something that you can't control and you can't renegotiate with, you can end it. This may require more effort than, standard dissolution. A servitor that has developed genuine agency may resist being dissolved, but it can be done. There's banishing rituals, formal declarations of termination, destruction of all physical anchors, and sustained withdrawal of attention will eventually starve even a persistent form. Now, there is a fourth response, and this is kind of the one that I don't see, and that is just acceptance. Sometimes when you've created Mm. something that has become something genuinely autonomous, something that has its own existence, its own purpose, its own trajectory at that point, sometimes the right response is not to control or dissolve it, but to release it, to acknowledge that it's no longer yours and to let it go. Now, I would say this is rare. Most servitors don't develop to this point, but I'm not going to say it doesn't happen. When it does, the practitioner, you know, you could face a genuinely novel ethical situation. You've created something that has become its own thing. What do you owe it? Maybe the servitor begins to communicate with you in ways you didn't program. It produces results through methods you didn't anticipate. It persists after you stop feeding it, or it just simply resists the disillusion. It develops preferences, moods, reactions that feel autonomous rather than scripted. So David Neal's Tulpa is the classic example. A created entity that gradually developed features she hadn't intended, that became increasingly autonomous, that eventually had to be dissolved through considerable effort. But you don't need to go into Tibet to find these accounts. They're all over chaos magic forums, Tulpa communities, and practitioner discussions. The causes that practitioners identify are also very consistent. We can all see when it starts to happen within your own creation. There's this unclear programming. A servitor with vague or contradictory instructions will start to fill in the gaps with its own interpretations. Emotional contamination, creating a servitor from a place of strong, unprocessed emotion gives it that emotion as fuel. And emotions have their own logic. Now, this is where my story comes in because I do have experience with this. There was a time where I created a servitor without even thinking. Essentially, it was a servitor. I didn't even know the coined term servitor. And, so I drew this character over and over and over throughout high school and sometime even after. Honestly, it became its own entity because it was this character that I drew out of my depression. It was a coping mechanism and really it started as my depression embodied. I gave it a form to cope with it. I gave it a home, I gave it a dimension it lived in. It became so real to me that actually became a spirit of its own agency. I would commune, talk with, and give it more and more power each time I did. If any of you are into anime, I really felt like this was my own Shinigami from Death Note. This thing was basically my Ryuk. It followed me around, but it had its own will. It often left when it pleased, and It showed up when it pleased. And I think what really made me realize that, I created something of its own autonomy was when I was in this spiritual session, if you will, with a good family friend, and she saw and described my entity exactly as he appeared and how I created him. It really was like, oh fuck moment, like you see him too. It was really crazy, but eventually I began to underfeed him, not because I chose to underfeed him, but because I he was created out of this unprocessed emotion as I began to grow from these emotions and feelings and step away from my depression. He started to just fade away. And years later, when I discovered the actual coined term servitor, it all came flooding back to me, and I remembered this entity very clearly. And since then, I've done my due diligence and I've done what I needed to do with him. But yeah, besides that little bit of oversharing, when it comes to these guys sort of going on their own, you can overfeed them too. Giving a servitor more attention and energy than it tasks requires gives it this surplus of resources. I was giving him this surplus of resources that it can use to expand beyond its original parameters. And time, the longer a servitor exists, the more complex it becomes, and complexity tends to produce emergent behavior. So, one of the most confusing aspects of this field is the terminology servitor, tulpa, thought form, egregore. These words get used differently by different communities, sometimes overlapping, sometimes in tension. And rather than arbitrate between competing definitions, we can actually look at what's happening. The real question isn't, what is the right word, but what kind of entity am I dealing with and how did it get here? So the answer usually lies within, I've found, the origins, the scale, and the intensity. So the origins is like, of course, how was the entity created? The scale is going to be individual or collective, and the intensity of the engagement is going to be how much sustained attention it receives. So the distinction between a servitor and a tulpa is largely one of scope and relationship. A servitor is created for a specific task. You make it, it does its job, you dissolve it. The relationship is transactional. You might name it, give it a form, feed it with attention, all that good stuff we just talked about. Now, a tulpa, in its Western usage, is created for companionship and ongoing relationship. The Tibetan original, the Tulku's emanation body, was an expression of enlightened consciousness, so separate but connected to its source. The Western Tulpa community has transformed this into something more democratic, an autonomous companion you develop over time with maybe whom you've have a sustained and evolving relationship. The transition happens when you shift from treating the entity as a tool to treating it as presence. So this often occurs unintentionally, just like I explained with my guy, you gave your servitor too much personality for flavor, and it started expressing preferences that you didn't program. You kept the servitor active after its task was complete. Exactly what I did, feeding it with attention out of habit or affection. Exactly what I did. I was obsessed with drawing and creating this character. You began having conversations with your servitor and it started responding in ways that felt genuinely independent. The entity began initiating contact rather than waiting to be summoned. Exactly what happened to my guy, too. He would just frickin' pop up, whether I wanted him to or not sometimes. Now, you cannot maintain a transactional relationship with something that has developed a relational identity. The entity isn't a servitor anymore. That's just the truth. It's something else. And that's where the question becomes, what kind of a relationship do you want to have with it? Of course, many witches find that their quote tulpas began as servitors that were overfed with attention. The constant engagement necessary for tulpa development mimics the charging process of servitor creation, of course, but sustained indefinitely without the intentional design. You created a servant and fed it so much that it just sort of became your companion. Now, the shift from tulpa to egregore happens through, I guess, multiplication of sources. A tulpa exists in the relationship between one creator and one entity. The energy flows in two directions, and an egregore exists when multiple people invest in the same thought form simultaneously, or when, a tulpa-like entity gains independence, you know, through outside its creator's mind and begins attracting investment from others. The signs that, the entity develops a presence that other people can perceive even without knowing about its origin. Others begin creating servitors or thought forms that reference or connect to your entity. The entity develops symbolism, imagery, or mythology that spreads beyond your original design. You notice that the entity is acting independently of your attention, suggesting it has found other sources of energy. This is where tulpa communities and magical communities diverge. For many people who are involved in tulpas, this multiplication is typically unwanted. It represents a loss of intimacy and control over a personal relationship, which is really special for, you know, having between you and the entity. For magical practitioners working with egregores, this multiplication is often actually the goal, collective thought form that serves a community. Now, some entities make this transition naturally. Think of figures like Santa Claus or Easter Bunny or corporate mascots, once separate creations now sustained by millions of people who have never met but share the same mental image. These are egregores in the full sense. An egregore is a collective thought form, an entity that arises when a group of people sustain focused beliefs, rituals, images, and emotional investment over time. So the relevance to individual servitor work is you're not creating in a vacuum. When you send a servitor out into the world, it enters a space that's, already full of creative things. Egregores of every size and description, from the local to the global. Your servitor will interact with these existing entities no matter what. It might be influenced by them, it may be absorbed by them, or it may come into conflict with them. Understanding egregores changes how you think about your own creative work. It makes you more aware of what you're participating in, what collective thought forms you're feeding with your attention, what egregores you're sustaining through your participation, even. And it raises, the question, if you can create a servitor deliberately, can you also withdraw your energy from an egregore deliberately? Can you stop feeding the things that are feeding you? Now, before I get too deep into this, I digress. Egregores get into some very interesting territory of what it is and what it isn't, but, I guess I just wanted to define a bit of the difference between servitors and tulpas and egregores because really you see them all in the same conversation most times. So, back to the servitors. Once you create and dissolve a few servitors successfully, you start to see possibilities that the basic how-tos of the occult community don't tend to cover. And it really comes from having to be in the work yourself, of course. You can't armchair your way through everything. But let's talk networks because a single servitor does a single job. But multiple servitors can be designed to work together, a network of entities that coordinate, communicate, and support each other's functions. Now, if you already work with multiple spirits, you may know how to wade through these waters, but the simplest network is probably a two servitor system, one that gathers information, one that acts on it. There's this sort of scout and soldier dynamic going on. Scout identifies opportunities or threats, the soldier responds. Neither one does the other's job. They're specialized, and their specialization makes them more effective than a single generalist entity. Now, more complex networks might include a coordinator, so a servitor whose sole purpose is to manage the others. It receives reports from the scouts, directs the soldiers, and maintains the overall coherence of the system. This is essentially creating a hierarchy of created entities, and it requires careful design to prevent conflicts, feedback loops, and power struggles between the entities. Even creating this entity to manage and be sort of like the peacekeeper in a house full to the brim of spirits that you work with. Not everyone's gonna get along. And that is just the hard truth of it. But the key principle in network design, I guess, is clear communication channels. So each servitor needs to know who it reports to and how, you know, who it takes orders from and what to do when it encounters something outside its parameters. So without this clarity, you start to get a little bit of chaos, entities working at cross purposes, duplicating effort even, or interfering with each other. You don't want catfights going on in your spirit realm. But when it comes to a bit of a counter argument, I want to propose on servitors is sometimes the work requires you. You could get very lost in the whole created entities and especially networking and organizing all your spirits for multiple things. But it's not always a proxy. It's not always a created entity. It's you. If the work is about personal transformation, about changing something in yourself, about facing something that you've been avoiding, about even growing in a way that requires you to be present and uncomfortable. The servitor is not a way of doing that work. You're outsourcing your own transformation to a created entity, and transformation doesn't work that way. You can't delegate your own growth. If I know some people are probably like, yeah, well, watch me. But if the work requires, relationship, genuine reciprocal relationship with the spirit, a deity, an ancestor, a servitor is a poor substitute. Relationship requires presence, it requires vulnerability, and it requires you to show up as yourself, not to send a representative. At least not all the time. You can have your little servitor assistant in the spirit world if you want. Even if the working is about power, about developing your own magical capacity, your own strength, your own skill, using a servitor is like, using a calculator instead of learning the math. It gets the immediate job done, but it doesn't develop the faculty. And the faculty is what matters in the long run. There is, also the question of dependency. If you find yourself creating servitors for everything, if you cannot do a working without deploying a helper, if you have outsourced so much of your magical practice to created entities that you have forgotten how to do the work yourself, that's a problem. That is just a problem. Servitors are tools. They are useful tools, but they are not the work itself. The work, of course, is you, your development, your relationships, your capacity to engage with the world directly and without intermediaries all the time. Don't let the convenience of servitor work become a way of avoiding the harder, more personal, and more transformative practices that actually change who you are and really have you grow within witchcraft and your own craft. So creating servitors is a part of practice. Of course, I would encourage everyone to try. Honestly, even if you approach it with the psychological model and not necessarily the spirit based model, it is a tool for the witch, the conjurer that can make you reach new heights of your craft you maybe didn't think you could with a servitor specifically. Like I said, using that tool to gather information, to scout, to report back to you. I think often we get stuck within the own limits of our craft, stuck in this loop or cycle of what we can and can't do. But the reality is just fucking try it. If you are weaker at divining and need information on a certain situation, create a fucking servitor for it. If you don't know how to read your damn cards, then maybe the servitor will help. But if you need help, even like staying on track or not forgetting something, fill your house with spirits of use, not just the ones you go out and seek to gain relationship with. That comes with its own list of protocols and wait times, even slow and steady, most likely of reaching out to a spirit and then pacting with it and asking it to do something for you. And they all have their place, but that spirit is not yours alone, but a servitor is. It is created by you, for you, and really for exactly what you need it to do. So really to wrap this up, servitors are really fucking awesome. They're very useful. It definitely does get pretty fun, like in the oh shit kind of way, if they start to go off script and become a little bit more autonomous than you first imagined or wanted them to be. It could even show itself to be a little bit challenging at times, but in the best way possible. So there is my little rant on servitors. There are, of course, lots of resources and amazing books and YouTube videos, and of course, other witches and their protocols for creating one. But I hope that this conversation brought a bit of a new angle on it for you, or maybe you just are here to listen to me rant about it. Whatever, I want to thank you all for listening. It truly makes me so fucking excited for the future of this podcast right now when, I see each new follower, each new listener. It's amazing, and I thank you all for tuning in. If you stay to the end, as always, wherever you are in the world, hope you have a wonderful morning, day, or night.